questions. I'm sure you will be stimulated by these three supposedly very different, but all concentrating on the issue. Anybody? The lady at the back.
My voice is low there. Okay, my question is for Professor Sorbera. You mentioned feminism is the only successful revolution in the 20th century. Can you please elaborate on this because actually quite much?
Yes, of course, it sounds as an overstatement, and it is meant to be like that. But when I refer to feminism as the successful revolution, I think about the big change in mentalities and in behaviors which we as citizens and as women have witnessed over the century. If we think about the life of our ancestors and we think about our lives and our expectations and our desires, we absolutely are witnessing a revolution which is still ongoing, which is still unaccomplished because, of course, nothing is granted and nothing is forever. But we can't overlook the fact that things have changed, and if they have changed, it's because there have been people who have pushed for change.
I'd like first to thank you for the interesting papers. First, about China, I have an impression. I visited China for once, and I have an impression that the Chinese people are only interested in their daily life, direct interests. And according to Han Han's point of view, is there any possibility in China for a democratic change, for some kind of revolution regarding their huge number of people? That's a question I'd like you to a little bit enlighten. Another question for Professor Lucia about the own history of Egyptian feminism. A century ago, as you said, I think this history has its own characteristics. It goes up and down according to the context. A very complicated circumstances in the Egyptian and Arab culture. What do you think about this stage of history? Not only about, I'm not asking only about the revolution, I'm asking about the whole movement of Egyptian feminism. How do you see it in this stage of history? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. This is always, this is one of the key questions in China, and what I'm going to say harks back on what my colleague Professor McVicker was talking about, because I've been working on China for 30 years, and a lot of people, especially when I was teaching Asian courses, Asian courses, were saying, what the big difference between China and India, because India is a democracy, China is not a democracy, but if you look at economics, so there is always this is a big question. If we look at it in an historical perspective, we have to take into consideration the fact that the word democracy didn't exist in Chinese language until the Marxist theory arrived in China. I mean, there was a very important movement in China as well as in Egypt, but it's a totally different movement in 1919, what is called the May 4th movement. And during that time, because it was a movement for democracy, one of the most important movements for democracy in China in the 20th century, the word democracy was transliterated into démocratie which was democracy transliterated into Chinese. And then democracy was called Mr. De, with a kind of masculine idea of democracy. You know, in all the documents we were in that movement. That movement was also repressed. You know, there is a whole history of political movements that are called revolutionary, you know, in the kind of appraisal that we make of the history of China, not only the 1989 Tiananmen movement, that advocated democracy, but all these movements were repressed. I'm not. I mean, what I found interesting, for example, in Han Han, when Han Han, this blogger, is talking about democracy, he's really linking it with what you said. I mean, with the interests of the people, because we talk about rights. But you know, even the word rights itself in Chinese is a very complex word. As a matter of fact, without going into the whole complexity of this word, but the many scholars argue that Chinese don't have this kind of, you know, have not developed this kind of elaborated habitus or mindset to really, because of they live in this system, you know, to really understand rights, and they are definitely interested in their own interests. So there is this whole debate, because the word in Chinese, the word for rights is pronounced chuan li, and the word for power in Chinese is also pronounced chuan li, but it uses the second character li, is the character of interests, okay, in the power dimension of the word, but in the other one is the character for strength. But there is this is the kind of complexity that we face in China today, when you know, when we talk about how to, you know, beside advocating democracy, what does it mean to bring democracy to China? I mean, there is a lot of debate in the last few weeks because of the party congress. A lot of people say from the West, you know, the Western media are saying, what about democratic reforms? But really, what you see in Han Han, in Liu Xiaobo, in Yu Hua, when they talk about, you know, revolution and democracy and so on and so forth, they say actually the people. Han Han is very critical, for example. Han Han says not a lot of people really understand what democracy is in China today. And unfortunately, because of this whole, and this is my own personal paper, is because of this change, you know, this shift from the whole revolutionary discourses into this reform, which means economic reforms. And this whole idea of Deng Xiaoping, you know, some people will become rich first, and then, you know, this whole emphasis on stability above all, and, you know, this whole machine that the party state has created to preserve stability. The idea of this is why I thought Han Han was an interesting case, because it's really emblematic of this whole generation, the post-Tiananmen generation, that seems to be, this is what many scholars say, a generation that cares about their interests, much more than their own rights.
Thank you for your questions, which allows me to better elaborate a point that I didn't have the time to discuss before. I was in Egypt in 2001, in 2004, and then I came back 1 year last year, in 2011. And both in 2001, in 2004 in particular, I did some research at the New Women Foundation and the archives of the Women and Memory Forum. And I did the same last year. And I can say that the feelings, the humor, how do you say humor? The feelings I witnessed last year was the mood was completely different from 2004. There was a new energy, a renewed. I don't like to use the word hope because I prefer optimism to hope, and which I didn't see in 2004. But this is not a scholarly idea. I mean, it's just a feeling that I had. Of course, and talking about feminism today, and not only in Egypt, implies several challenges in terms of generational relationships, because women who were born in the 80s and I would say 70s and 80s in a post-feminist world, they have been educated thinking that we don't need feminism because we already, formally, we have the suffrage, we have equal rights. What do we want to do with feminism? So there is a need to reinvent and reformulate this idea of feminism and fight for gender equality. Of course, there is also an important shift from women's rights to gender rights. Now, and in the particular context of Egypt, perhaps this is particularly important also because we have to say that for a long period, unfortunately, the word feminism has been hijacked by the regime and with the complicity of the international powers. So there are many challenges that we need to face in order to rebuild a shared activism, which involves women and men together. Now, I can say today, both in Egypt and elsewhere, in Italy, in Australia, where I live, that new generations of men are more and more involved in discourses about gender equality. And there are a plurality of ideologies on the ground which compete but at the same time collaborate. So it's quite complex and it's quite fascinating. The space of the informality, the informal groups, I think they are, and the cultural productions, of course, are perhaps the most interesting and the most vibrant in this moment of passages. And of course the work that already existing organizations have been doing in the year before the revolutions and are still doing now is absolutely important. As a historian, I think that the work that Women and Memory Forum is doing of transmitting, keeping the archives, making them available to new generations of historians is absolutely important and valuable. But there are many other organizations working in other fields which are doing important works. And yes.
I have two questions to Professor McVicker. You said that the poll or the survey said that 54% of Americans prefer or support stability over democracy when it comes to the Middle East or the Arab world. I mean, the Middle East is a way of not saying the Arab world. So do you think that this reflects the way Americans see or the preference of Americans when it comes to their own country? Will they also prefer stability over democracy when it comes to America itself? This is the first question. And the second one, it's really short, and I know the answer can take hours, but I'd like to have your opinion about it. Is there a real democracy in the world?
I commend you on your very intelligent questions. I think as much of this conference has been attempting to speculate, democracy is an ideal, perhaps, that is never truly achieved or won or a promised land where we finally arrive. And I think it's always going to be a local phenomenon, right? There is no universal sense of what a democracy looks like. It's always going to have its local characteristics and struggles and interventions. And so I don't think there is some great democracy with a capital D in gold shining letters ready to come down on us. So to answer your second question first. In the United States, it's an interesting statistic, I think, that Pew Research, and Pew is P-E-W in case you want to go online. It depends on who you ask, perhaps. I think there are some people, I would say young people in general, are of a very mixed mind. On the one hand, they're told from birth, the most important function is to get a job. There are no jobs for them, very few jobs for them in the traditional manner, and so I think for them stability means a kind of poverty of spirit. I think they're hungry for something, for newness, and they are perhaps the ones through whom newness will come into the American system. For others, stability is extremely important. It means the perpetuation of the status quo and an arrangement of privilege and power which they are unwilling to give up. And so I think we're at a critical moment in American history, actually. I was glad to be able to come to Egypt with Obama being reelected, because the alternative would have been a disaster. But I think, as everyone here knows, probably, the Obama administration in 2008 gave us hope, change we can believe in, and for many, we are still waiting for the change that we can believe in. So I think it depends on who you ask. Thank you for your question.
Yes. First of all, I want to thank all three panelists for very interesting and penetrating analyses. But I had a question for Professor McVicker. Do you think that the Occupy movement is exhausted, or does it still have a role to play, and what form might that take?
Well, I think the hallmark of the Occupy movement is that no one can speak for it, and so I hesitate to try to speculate what role it should play. I think that's precisely what it's not about. It's not about a should or an ought. It's about what's possible, and the local variations are what influences each place's understanding of what Occupy means. I don't think that media representation of its death and decay is accurate at all, at least not according to the Occupy network. If you go to the Occupy website, you can see that there are still plenty of energy and enthusiasm in the Occupy movement, and that it is indeed changing. It is transforming. It is no longer the occupation of a public space, a media kind of spectacle. That was its first phase, perhaps very much in a parallel fashion to the first 18 days of the revolution. I think it's finding its new form, and it remains to be seen what it will look like. I can't predict what it will be, but I think change is on the horizon, and it's not going to be coming from the top of the administration in Washington.
I would also like to repeat my thanks and appreciation for a really, really exciting and interesting panel. I'll just ask Lucia a question or make a comment. I thought it was quite fascinating and exhilarating in a way that you said that feminism is the only successful revolution. Of course, it's very provocative, and it makes one somehow stop to consider, because so many of us who have either been acting as feminists in some way or other in here and studying it get rather depressed at some level at what hasn't been achieved, even though I have also recognized specific achievements. But I think it's a very fascinating way to look at it, and actually I rather agree. There's still, it's mustamira, it's part of the, continuing process, but so much has been so shaken up and changed. And what are people so out of sorts about is, women and gender issues. And that shows that there's a lot of irritation with where women are and what they're doing, and how perhaps we should push them back or corral them or something. And also, if you think back to September 1929 in this very university, there were 6 women students, and they weren't even properly, they were somehow intruders. And Ahmed Lutfi Asayed, who was the rector, sort of allowed them, as it were. He kind of turned the other way when they came in, and Hussein was dean. And if you look around just this room or just this conference, I mean, that's already some kind of an indication. I mean, professors and students, and God knows who's, that there was a huge amount of success. And I think that's a very good way to think about it. Also, I have thought about feminism during the revolution time, when I was during the uprising part of the revolution and since. But the uprising part, that I saw it as very embedded. I mean, somehow liberation, women's liberation, women's rights, people's rights, everything was out there. It was infused and embedded. And I think it's still part of the different layers of revolution. And the final point is, I've been talking, I'm doing a lot of research with young revolutionaries, and so many of the male revolutionaries are claiming the title of feminism, and they and women I'm talking to are almost indistinguishable in what they want for their lives, for laws, and for ways of organizing society.
Here, over there.
Thank you, Dr. Lucia, for a very interesting presentation. With regards to women and the revolution, I want to bring the question of power into the discourse, because I think the question of power is very important, power dynamics. I think gender issues have become the locale in which all the power dynamics that are taking place in Egypt right now are unfolding. They're ebbing and flowing within that very same locale. So it's very important to question those powers. What about the Islamists, the Islamist strength in Egypt? How is it influencing gender issues? There's a difference between the discourse that you get within certain circles of people who espouse that cause for years, and what you would get from 40% of the population, which is below poverty line. Okay? So I think, in terms of the sample itself, it would be very different. And again, it's a question of economic, political, social power. How do you somehow bring all of those factors, all of those layers into your discourse and into your analysis? I think for Egyptians, there's definitely a change in our way of thinking of the role of women during the revolution, which is ongoing, as you mentioned. But I think we failed to cash in as women through the revolution. Look at Libya, look at Tunisia. In Tunisia, 26% of the Constituent Assembly is women. When there was a problem about the complementarity article in the Constitution, they managed to change it. In Libya, 16% of parliament is women. Where do we stand as Egyptians from all of that? That's the kind of action that I would like to see take place in Egypt. Thank you.
I can briefly, thank you, these are important points, in fact, and I have asked some of these questions to the young women I have interviewed 1 year ago. So my data are not updated. In those days, which was the period of the elections and the first results were coming out, actually, the young women I interviewed were much more concerned of the military power than of the Islamists. So in their answers, they were very open to the democratic process. They had the idea that okay, they will gain now, but if they would not answer to our expectations, now we have learned the street to the square, and we know that we can again do what we have done. Now perhaps the feelings can be changed. I don't have a clear answer for now, but what is sure is also that when we say Islamists, we also need to understand that it's a differentiation within the Islamist, it's not a block. And so also positions about gender are different according to the politics. And of course, I still think that the importance of grassroots movements and grassroots organizations and cultural works is seminal, also in affecting the political and the economic sphere. I mean, we will never be able as women to achieve the power if we replicate the mechanism, the male mechanism of power. We don't need to access politics as in the acception that the patriarchal system has invented it. Otherwise, we will have another the perpetuation of the same system, and Margaret Thatcher has been a power for women, but she was not a sister, she was not a feminist. So, and Angela Merkel, etc. So we need to change the invent with creativity a new idea of politics and of power, of leadership more than power.
Sure. Is the question on you? Do you want to raise your hand? Okay. So the question is, I've linked the LGBTQ movement to political awareness of youth, but is it political? I think it is political, and I think that's an example of the kind of different sort of political civic engagement, if you will, that I'm optimistic about on the part of young people in the U.S. There's a different kind of politics than the one that's part of a voting booth. I'm not trying to suggest that the voting booth is not important, but I'm trying to suggest that if one is defining oneself as politically active because one is trying to change the sort of normative heterosexual discourses of power, that is a very political kind of engagement. And so I think that through that awareness, struggle, activity, those other more entrenched forms of subjective political power then must change. They will change at the voting booth and beyond. But I can even say that at the voting booth there have been some discussions. So I think they are happening simultaneously. They aren't necessarily part of the same movement, but there are multiple movements. And I guess that's what gives me optimism, is that there is no one single uniform way to speak about what young people are doing today. I think that they are each working on their own local issues, and collectively there is change happening. It doesn't meet the narrow prescriptive definition of the mainstream media. The mainstream media doesn't pay attention to those things until it begins to shake the walls of power. That's when it suddenly becomes a problem, right? And then it becomes negatively articulated. So I think there's lots of change happening. You may not read about it in the newspaper or watch it on the television news, but I do think it's a redefinition of what's political. Thank you for your question.
Thank you, and thank you all, and of course, as you all said and felt, the stimulation of this last panel, which, if I may paraphrase D.S. Eliot, in end is our beginning. Because we've been talking about the meaning of revolution, the meaning even of the word revolution, from three different perspectives, but all coming together. What do we mean by revolution? What is revolution? What will revolution be? And also the idea of history. Now, I know this is not fair, but if I may, I would like to intrude or interpolate a bit of personal history, if you will allow me. I was taught history by an imperial power as a schoolgirl, and I was taught by this imperial power about another imperial power. In fact, I was taught by Great Britain about Rome. And Rome, to us, was simply, we were told it was the most wonderful thing, because there was the Pax Romana, like the Pax Britannica. And nobody revolted against Rome, and Egypt was only the granary of Rome. And until much later, when I started to read, I realized that history has told us there were many revolutions in the history of Egypt. We think even Pharaonic terms. When we think of just Akhenaten, I mean, yes, he was the pharaoh, but he overturned established religion. I mean, this is the biggest revolution possible. Of course, it didn't last, and this is where we go on. But the imperial power also told us that the revolutions of 1882, 1919, and earlier, we never even knew there were any earlier, were simply, and I quote, rebellions. Rebellions against the benign power that was doing everything for us. And now these days, we have heard about different revolutions. The Velvet Revolution, the Jasmine Revolution, the Orange Revolution, the Rose Revolution. All very interesting names which need, I think, perhaps a lot of analysis and delving into. But I would like to go back to thinking what revolution here has meant. Or, as we have been talking about in Staura Mustamila, the revolution is continuing. I would like to use the eternal present in English. The revolution continues forever. And this is where we may be. And if I may just end with words that perhaps we heard from Bill Ashcroft's lecture, which are hope. I don't know if I hope. But I would like to again, I'm sorry, I'm going to be personal again, because I'm going to quote from Emily Dickinson, the recluse, supposedly American poet, a great revolutionary in her way. And this is what she says, and I'll just quote 2 verses. Hope is a thing with tremors that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. And sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm that could abash that little bird that keeps so many warm. Thank you, and thank you.